Ronak D. Desai, partner Paul Hastings, and legal expert joins us live on the broadcast from Los Angeles. Ronak, my first question to you is, on one hand, the US Supreme Court has called all of US President Trump's reciprocal tariffs as illegal, including that 18% tariffs that were imposed on India. However, at the same time, US President made it clear that the US-India trade deal framework, which includes these 18% tariffs, will remain. So what does this really mean for India? Help us decode that.
Absolutely. So the Supreme Court has said the president did not have the authority to impose these tariffs. That's what this case was about. This was ultimately about not just what the tariffs are, their taxes, but who gets to impose them. The president says, I get to impose them. I'm the head of the government. I'm the executive branch. The Supreme Court finally said, nope, you're not allowed to do this. Ultimately, Congress is the branch of the United States government that has the authority to impose these tariffs on different countries. As you rightfully point out, the president, of course, has said, listen, there's a number of trade deals that we've been striking with several different countries around the world for the past year. What does it mean for these countries? What does it mean specifically for India? Ultimately, the US-India interim trade deal that had been struck just a couple of weeks ago, actually, part of the architecture of that deal was founded upon these tariffs. And what this means now is that despite what the president may say, ultimately the 18% tariff that had been negotiated between the United States and India is now seriously in question. They've been ruled by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional. Ultimately, do I think that the overall terms and conditions of the deal and what the two countries are trying to achieve through this interim deal is going to move forward? Yes. Does it mean at the same time, however, that this 18% tariff now is in serious question? Absolutely. I think one other thing to point out here is that the president was very clear that, you know what, even Supreme Court, if you say that I cannot do this under this specific set of authorities, there's other authorities, there's other tools in my toolkit, other weapons that I have that I can use to essentially impose tariffs on other countries. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. And this 10% tariff that he had announced from the podium following the Supreme Court's decision, that 10% authority, or tariff rather, comes from the president's ability to essentially invoke a whole other law that says, listen, if there's a trade balance between the United States and a different country, you can impose up to 15% on that country, but it's only for 150 days.
Exactly, Ronak. That's what I want to really ask you about, the alternative laws that now, the alternate options that US President Trump has, and what sort of challenges does the president now face when it comes to imposing tariffs using these alternative laws, including the Trade Act of 1974? And another part of that question really is the big doubt about the fact that will the US now have to refund that almost $175 billion of tariffs that have already been collected over the past year?
Right. So the question of the refunds, let me start there, is of course perhaps the one that everyone is asking. The Supreme Court was conspicuously quiet on the question of refunds. If you had watched or listened to the oral arguments that had taken place last year over this issue in the Supreme Court, the topic of refunds was one that all the justices were focused on, and that many justices asked questions about, saying, how is this going to work? Assuming we rule these tariffs to be unconstitutional, as you rightfully point out, Disha, there's about $175 billion in estimated tariffs that have been collected. What happens to that money? The Supreme Court decided to be completely quiet about that. They did not address how those refunds should be issued, who should issue those refunds, how folks that have paid these tariffs can get their money back, which countries or which companies would be entitled to those refunds. Now, interestingly enough, the president addressed this topic during his press conference following the Supreme Court's decision, and he expressly said, listen, this is going to be A, big problem, and B, the lower courts, the ones that sit below the Supreme Court, that sit below the appellate courts, they're going to have to figure this out.
Absolutely.
They're going to have to ultimately come up with the framework to see whether or not folks are entitled to these refunds, and if so, how.
Absolutely. Right.
I think the second issue here, in terms of these other laws that you've asked about, the other tools, so, in the president's tool chest, there are other laws on the American books that the president can safely rely on. The one that was just struck down by the Supreme Court deals with what we call reciprocal tariffs underneath the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, the IEEPA. The Supreme Court said you can't do it there, but there's other
Absolutely,
ones you
Ronak.
can't do
I
it under
think
Section
the
301,
big
Section
question
232.
really is now, of course, he has these alternative options, but what about the refunds? Will the various companies that were forced to pay the tariffs now be refunded? A lot of uncertainty remains after the US Supreme Court's big tariff decision. Thank you so much, Ronak, for joining us.